Have you ever stopped to think that the darkest moments of your life, that crisis, that loss, that feeling of being completely lost were not accidents? What if I told you that these periods of chaos were not the work of fate or bad luck, but a surgical operation, a secret mechanism triggered by the deepest, wisest part of you, a deliberate act of sabotage, designed by your own soul with a single purpose, to destroy the false life you have built, so that your true life could finally begin? This is the most shocking and liberating truth of depth psychology. Your ruin is, in fact, your rescue. What you call rock bottom is the fertile ground that yourself has prepared, so that the seed of who you truly are could germinate. What is at stake is not just happiness, but wholeness. And the journey to this wholeness, the process of individuation, requires you to descend into your own hell to rescue the pieces of yourself you have abandoned along the way. This is not a conversation for the faint of heart. It is for those who are tired of living on the surface, for those who feel that there is something more pulsating beneath the skin of reality. If you feel this call, this restlessness, then prepare yourself. What you are about to discover will reconfigure the way you see yourself, your fears, and your own destiny. To embark on this journey and not get lost in the labyrinth, you need a map. This channel is that map. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because each video is a key piece to deciphering the code of your own soul. Leave a like as a sign that you accept the call, and comment the word journey so that I know you are ready to begin the descent. Do not skip a single second. Your transformation depends on it. There is a subtle symptom, a low fever in the soul, that modern medicine insists on diagnosing as anxiety, depression, or simple discontent. It is the feeling of being in a play where everyone knows the lines but you. It is the success that tastes like ashes, the relationship that feels like a gilded cage, the life that, from the outside, is perfect, but inside echoes an absolute void. This is not a defect to be corrected with pills or positive thoughts. It is the first tap on the shoulder, the insistent whisper of the self, the organizing center of the psyche. It is the call to individuation, a call that, most of the time, is violently ignored. We live in a civilization that trains us to be deaf to this inner voice. From childhood, we are taught to look outward for validation, for direction, for purpose. The world offers us a limited menu of identities: the good student, the successful professional, the family man, the exemplary mother. And we, hungry for belonging, devour these roles without question. The call is then muffled by the noise of others' expectations, by productivity goals, by the incessant search for more. More money, more status, more distractions. The problem is that the soul does not speak the language of the ego. It communicates through symbols, dreams, synchronicities, and when all else fails, through collapse. The panic that arises from nowhere, the depression that sets in for no apparent reason, the midlife crisis that sets the carefully constructed life ablaze. These are not signs that you are breaking. They are signs that your soul is trying to break the shell of your false life. Resistance to this call is the primary source of neurotic suffering. It is the energy of an unlived life that turns against us, manifesting as bitterness, cynicism, and a chronic feeling that something fundamental is missing. It is the attempt to fill a spiritual void with material achievements, an effort as futile as trying to quench thirst with sand. The journey of individuation, therefore, begins with an act of surrender. The surrender to the idea that the map the world gave you does not lead to the treasure you seek. It is the courage to admit, I am lost. It is in the recognition of this disorientation that a new compass, the inner compass, can finally begin to work. To ignore the call is to choose the security of the known prison over the freedom of the unknown territory. It is a slow death, a petrification of the soul. To answer the call is the most terrifying and most vital act a human being can perform. It is the first step to going off script and starting to write your own story. We all use a persona. It is our interface with the world, the mask of civility that allows us to interact, cooperate, and survive in society. It is a tool, a psychological uniform we wear to play our roles. The problem arises when the uniform merges with the skin, when the actor forgets he is performing and begins to believe he is the character. This is the great silent epidemic of our time, identification with the persona. It is the executive who doesn't know who he is without his badge, the mother who disintegrates when her children grow up, the intellectual who hides behind quotes and theories. They have built a persona so successful, so polished and applauded, that the fear of revealing the naked face behind it is paralyzing. The cost of this identification is the loss of the soul. To live exclusively through the persona is an endless exhaustion. It is a constant calculation. What will they think? How should I act? What is expected of me? Spontaneity dies, creativity is suffocated, and genuine joy becomes a distant memory. The individual becomes a perfectly packaged product for social consumption, hollow on the inside. The vital energy that should be used for inner development is spent on maintaining this facade. That is why so many successful people are profoundly unhappy. They have conquered the world, but lost themselves in the process. The inner dialogue ceases, replaced by the monologue of external expectations. Individuation requires the painful but necessary differentiation between the I and the persona. It is not about destroying the mask. It remains a useful tool. It is about knowing that it is a tool and not the totality of your being. The process is like shedding skin. It is removing, layer by layer, the conditioning, the borrowed beliefs, and the false identities we have accumulated throughout life to be accepted. Each layer removed reveals a more sensitive, more vulnerable, but infinitely more real skin. It is a return to authenticity. And authenticity has a price. It often means disappointing people who fell in love with your mask. It means renegotiating relationships, careers, and even fundamental values. It is a path that often leads to a period of solitude, as the old social world of the persona no longer serves, and the new world, based on the soul, has not yet fully formed. But it is in this fertile solitude that a true connection with oneself can happen. It is the radical choice between being loved for your falsehood or risking rejection for your truth. The journey of individuation invites you to make this choice, not with arrogance, but with a deep H, humility, recognizing that the only approval that truly nourishes the soul is your own. On the journey into the depths, there comes a moment when we encounter a figure we have spent our entire lives avoiding, our own shadow. The shadow is our other self, the dark basement of our psyche, where we throw everything that is considered unacceptable by our ego and by society, our most primitive instincts, our repressed anger, our greed, our envy, our inappropriate sexuality, our vulnerability. It is the repository of everything we are ashamed of being. The initial reaction is always one of denial and projection. The shadow is easier to see in others. We point the finger at the colleague's arrogance, the neighbor's laziness, the politician's immorality, without realizing we are just looking in a mirror. What irritates and judges us most in others is often an unrecognized aspect of our own shadow. As long as the shadow remains unconscious, it governs us. It erupts in moments of stress, in slips of the tongue, in inexplicable outbursts of rage, sabotaging our relationships and our lives. It is the moralist who secretly has perverse fantasies, the passive-aggressive person who smiles while planting the seeds of discord, the unintegrated. Shadow makes us hypocrites and dangerous, for we have no control over what we refuse to see. The work of individuation requires an act of extreme moral courage to withdraw the projections and face the shadow as part of ourselves. It is not about unleashing evil, but about integrating the energy contained in these rejected aspects. Jung said that the shadow is 90% pure gold. Hidden in the trash of our psyche is our vitality, our creativity, our assertiveness, our passion. Repressed anger can be the source of courage to set boundaries. Greed can be the seed of ambition to achieve a great dream. The vulnerability we hide can be the key to true intimacy. Integrating the shadow is an alchemical process. It is taking the lead of our being and transforming it into gold. This does not mean acting impulsively on every dark instinct. It means bringing these impulses into consciousness, dialoguing with them, understanding them, and consciously deciding how to channel that energy constructively. It is the difference between being possessed by rage and using the energy of rage to fight for justice. By embracing the shadow, we become more human, more whole, and, paradoxically, less likely to do evil. A person who knows their own darkness is much safer than one who lives in the illusion of their own purity. The encounter with the shadow is the end of innocence and the beginning of true integrity. It is a humbling process that shatters our idealized self-image, but gives us back our wholeness. After the confrontation with the shadow, the journey takes us to an even deeper layer of the unconscious, the encounter with our inner sexual counterpart, the soul image. In a man, this archetypal figure is the anima, the personification of all the feminine elements of his psyche. In a woman, it is the animus, the personification of the masculine. These are not social constructs of gender, they are primordial psychic structures. The anima in a man represents his capacity for relationship, his intuition, his moods, his connection with nature. And the unconscious, the animus in a woman governs her logical thinking, her capacity for discernment, her assertiveness, and her connection with spirit and structure. When these figures are unconscious, they wreak havoc. A man projects his undeveloped anima onto the women around him, seeking in them the goddess or mother he should find within himself. He becomes a hostage to inexplicable moods, sentimentality, or, at the other extreme, a cold cynicism, cut off from his emotional life. A woman, in turn, projects her animus, seeking in a man the hero or sage who will give her all the answers. She can be possessed by a negative animus, becoming dogmatic, argumentative, and disconnected from her bodily and intuitive wisdom, governed by a series of rigid and impersonal opinions. Individuation is the process of withdrawing these projections and beginning a conscious dialogue with this inner figure. For a man, it is the task of relating to his anima, of honoring his feelings, of listening to his intuition, of allowing himself to be vulnerable. In doing so, his anima ceases to be a capricious seductress and becomes his guide to the soul, the psychopomp who opens the doors to creativity and deep meaning. For a woman, the work is to confront her animus, to question her own dogmatic beliefs, to differentiate her authentic thoughts from the internalized opinions of her father or culture. In doing so, her animus ceases to be a sabotaging critic or a collective of judges and becomes her bridge to the world, a source of courage, clarity, and creative power. This work of integrating the anima and animus is what the alchemists called the coniunctio, the sacred marriage. It is the union of the sun and moon, of the king and queen, within the individual psyche. It does not make us less men or less women. On the contrary, it makes us more complete men and women. The man who has integrated his anima has access to an emotional depth and wisdom that make him stronger and more compassionate. The woman who has integrated her animus possesses a clarity of purpose and an inner strength that make her freer and more powerful. This inner marriage is the key to mature relationships, as we stop demanding that our partner be our lost half and can relate to him or her as a whole being, as an equal. It is the basis of true creativity, for it is from the union of opposites that all new life emerges. Diving even deeper, we find the soil from which everything sprouts, the collective unconscious, and inhabiting this soil are the archetypes, the primordial forms, the blueprints of human experience that have been inherited from our ancestors since the beginning of time. They are the characters in the great drama of life that live within each of us. The hero, the great mother, the wise old man, the trickster, the eternal child, the lover, the king. These are not mere concepts. They are living, autonomous energy centers in the psyche that shape our perceptions, motivate our behaviors, and write the scripts of our lives without our being aware of it. When an archetype is activated in us, we are possessed by it. We feel a force that seems greater than ourselves, a compulsion to act in a certain way. Think of the man who, activated by the hero archetype, sacrifices himself for a cause, or the woman who, under the influence of the great mother, fiercely nurtures and protects her family. These patterns are powerful and necessary. The danger lies in the unconscious identification with a single archetype. The person who identifies with the hero can become arrogant, unable to admit weakness, seeking dragons to slay even when there are none, and ultimately destroying himself in his incessant quest for battles. The one who identifies with the eternal child remains a poor Eternus, charming and full of potential, but unable to commit to reality and take on adult responsibilities. Individuation involves recognizing these archetypal patterns in our own lives. It is like becoming the director of our own internal play, rather than just being an unconscious actor. It means understanding which archetype is dominating the stage at any given moment and, more importantly, learning to invoke other archetypes when necessary. If life demands courage, we may need to connect with our inner hero. If we need wisdom and patience, we can invoke the wise old man. If life has become too rigid, perhaps it is time to give voice to the trickster, who breaks taboos and brings a new perspective through chaos and humor. The myths, fairy tales, and religions of the world are the great catalog of archetypes. They show us the patterns of the human journey in its most varied forms. To study these stories is to study oneself. It is to recognize that our personal dramas are not unique, but repetitions of eternal themes. This realization is profoundly liberating. It connects us to something larger than our small ego, to the great current of human experience. Understanding the archetypes gives us a map of the psyche and allows us to navigate our lives with more consciousness and freedom, ceasing to be puppets of the inner gods to become conscious collaborators in the unfolding of our own personal myth. Modern society treats suffering and crisis as an anomaly, a flaw in the system that must be eliminated as quickly as possible. Jungian psychology, however, offers a radically different perspective. The crisis is not the problem. It is the attempted solution. It is a portal. When the life we have built from our ego becomes too narrow for the soul, when the persona becomes a prison and the shadow cries out for attention, the psyche often orchestrates a crisis to force change. It is the collapse that precedes reconstruction. It is what the alchemists called nigredo, the phase of blackening, of dissolution, of putrefaction. Everything we thought was solid falls apart. The secure job is lost. The perfect marriage crumbles, health fails. The ego, which loves control and predictability, panics. This is the moment of rock bottom, and it is precisely here, in this place of absolute despair, that the magic happens. Because when all external structures and ego defenses are destroyed, something deeper has a chance to emerge. Rock bottom is the only place where we can find solid ground, not the false ground of our illusions, but the real ground of our being. The crisis forces us to abandon what is not essential. It strips us of our false identities, our vain ambitions, our superficial attachments. And in this state of nakedness and vulnerability, we are forced to ask the questions that truly matter. Who am I now? What really has value in my life? It is a compulsory invitation to introspection. It is the opportunity to find a new order, not an order imposed from the outside, but one that is born organically from the center of our own psyche, from the self. For this to happen, one must resist the temptation to fix the crisis quickly, to run back to what was familiar and safe. One must have the courage to remain in uncertainty, in the not knowing. It is in this liminal space, this fertile chaos, that the seed of a new consciousness can germinate. Individuation is not a linear path of continuous progress. It is a process of death and rebirth. We die to our old identity so that a new, more authentic, and broader one can be born. Every crisis is a rite of passage. By going through it consciously, we do not just survive, we are transformed. We gain depth, resilience, and a stronger connection to our inner center. We learn that we are not as fragile as our ego feared, and that there is a strength within us capable of guiding us through the darkest of nights. The crisis, therefore, ceases to be seen as a curse and comes to be recognized as a blessing in disguise, a severe but loving call from the soul to come home. In our culture, which idolizes the individual and self-sufficiency, it is dangerously easy to confuse individuation with individualism. This confusion is a fatal detour on the journey. Individualism is a movement of the ego. It is the effort to stand out, to be special, unique, different from others. It is based on separation and competition. The individualist says, I am my achievements, my opinions, my possessions. I am what differentiates me from the masses. It is a search for an identity built in opposition to the collective. This often leads to a narcissistic isolation, a fortress of the ego where the person feels superior, but is profoundly lonely and disconnected. Individuation, on the other hand, is a movement of the self. It is not about becoming different from others, but about becoming more fully oneself. The goal is not separation, but differentiation. Differentiation means being who you are, authentically and consciously. without getting lost in the herd mentality of the collective, but at the same time, recognizing your deep connection to that same collective. The process of individuation, paradoxically, makes us more capable of a true relationship with others and with the community. Why? Because by integrating our shadow, we stop projecting it onto others and can see them with more clarity and compassion. By withdrawing the projections of the animus, we can love real people, not idealizations. By disidentifying from the persona, our interactions become more authentic. The individualist rebels against the collective for fear of being swallowed by it. The individuated individual is able to participate in the collective consciously, bringing their unique contribution without losing their center. They do not need to rebel loudly because their authority comes from within. Jung stated that the true renewal of society would not come from mass movements, but from the inner transformation of individuals. A society is only as conscious as the individuals who compose it. Ego-focused individualism ultimately leads to more alienation and conflict. Individuation, which seeks connection with the self, leads to greater responsibility and a sense of belonging that is not based on conformity, but on mutual respect between whole beings. The journey is not to distance oneself from the world in a spiritual ivory tower. It is to become a more conscious and effective participant in the world. It is to discover your personal myth, your unique piece in the cosmic puzzle, and to play it with integrity and courage. It is the difference between an isolated island and a mountain that, while having its own peak, is undeniably connected to the earth that sustains everything. At the center of all the chaos and complexity of the psyche, there is a point of silence, an ordering principle. Jung called it the self. The self is not the ego. The ego is the center of consciousness, the I that thinks, feels, and acts in the everyday world. The self is the center of the total psyche, including the conscious and the unconscious. It is the totality of our being, the inner God, the image of wholeness that we all carry as a potential. The ego can be compared to the government of a country, while the self is the entire country, with its people, its history, its culture, and its geography. The goal of individuation is not to destroy the ego, but to place it in service of the self. It is a change of government from an egocracy to an inner theocracy, where the God is this totality that inhabits us. But how does one hear the voice of the self? It does not speak the language of the ego's linear logic. It communicates through a symbolic, poetic, often paradoxical language. The main channels of communication are dreams, synchronicities, active imagination, and the intuitions that come to us in moments of silence. Dreams are the nightly letters sent from the self. They are not random brain noise, but highly meaningful messages about the state of our psyche. They show us what we are neglecting, where we are imbalanced, what attitudes need to change. To learn the language of dreams, with its symbols and metaphors, is to learn to dialogue directly with our center. Synchronicity, a concept developed by Jung, is another channel. These are the meaningful coincidences, the events in the outer world that mysteriously mirror an inner state, giving us the feeling that the universe is conspiring to show us something. The person who thinks intensely of a distant friend and minutes later receives a call from them. These events shatter our purely causal worldview and point us toward a deeper, more meaningful order. Active imagination is a technique for consciously dialoguing with the figures of the unconscious. It is allowing an image from a dream or fantasy to develop, interacting with it as if it were a real person, asking questions and listening to its answers. It is a form of meditation that gives voice to the neglected parts of ourselves. To develop this connection with the self is to cultivate an internal compass. The ego, with its limited view, often gets lost. The self, with its view of the whole, always knows the way. The journey of individuation is the process of learning to trust this compass, even when it points in directions that frighten or challenge the ego. It is the transition from a life driven by external goals to a life guided by an inner sense of purpose. The ancient alchemists, in their laboratories, were not just trying to turn lead into gold. That was the external metaphor for a much deeper process, the transformation of the human psyche itself. Alchemy is the perfect symbolic map for the process of individuation. The journey begins with the prima materia, the raw material. This is our initial, unconscious, chaotic, and undifferentiated state, full of conflicts and projections. It is the lead of our unworked personality. The first stage of the work is the nigredo, the blackening. It corresponds to the encounter with the shadow, to the dissolution of the old identity in crisis. It is a period of depression, confusion, and despair, the black sun of the soul. It is the phase of putrefaction, where everything that is false must die and decompose so that something new can be born. It is the most difficult stage, where many give up, but the alchemist knows that it is essential to cook the matter in its own blackness, without trying to escape prematurely. Once the nigredo is overcome, the albedo, the whitening, emerges. It is the phase of purification, of washing. It corresponds to differentiation, to the work with the anima and animus. The light of consciousness begins to penetrate the darkness of the unconscious. It is a moment of clarity, of new insights, of withdrawing projections. The soul, which was submerged in matter, begins to be rescued. It is a state of lunar, reflective illumination, where we begin to see ourselves and the world with new eyes. However, the work is not yet complete. Next comes the citrinitas, the yellowing, which many later alchemists merge with the final phase. It is the sunrise, the wisdom that comes from experience. It corresponds to the insight of the inner wise old man. It is when the knowledge acquired in the albedo is transformed into lived wisdom. The light ceases to be merely reflected and becomes its own source. Finally comes the rubedo, the reddening. It is the culmination of the work, the creation of the philosopher's stone. It corresponds to the union of opposites, the sacred marriage of the conscious with the unconscious, the masculine with the feminine, heaven with earth. The self is realized. The individual does not become perfect, but whole. He is able to live his life with passion, the red of blood, and consciousness, the gold of the sun. It is the embodiment of the God-man archetype, not out of arrogance, but from having integrated his inner divinity into his humanity. This process is not linear. We often return to earlier stages at different levels of life, but the language of alchemy gives us the hope and the structure to understand that suffering has a purpose, that darkness is a prelude to light, and that within each of us lies the capacity to transform the lead of our existence into the gold of meaning. We have reached the end of this map, but not the end of the journey. The deepest realization of individuation is the understanding that there is no final destination. The self is not a static state to be achieved, but a dynamic process to be lived. The philosopher's stone is not an object to be possessed, but the very capacity to continue the process of transformation throughout one's life. The one who is individuated does not become an enlightened saint, free from all conflict. On the contrary, they become more capable of containing conflicts within themselves, of living in the tension of opposites without being torn apart. They accept their shadow as a constant companion, dialogue with their anima or animus as a life partner, and recognize the archetypes that dance on their inner stage. Life ceases to be a problem to be solved and becomes a mystery to be lived. Happiness, in the sense of a superficial and uninterrupted contentment, ceases to be the goal. In its place rises something much more robust and meaningful, a sense of purpose. The question changes from what do I want from life, to what does life want from me? The ego, now a loyal servant of the self, becomes the instrument through which the individual's unique potential can manifest in the world. Individuation is ultimately an act of love. Love for oneself in its totality, including the dark and broken parts. And from this radical self-love is born the capacity for a more genuine love for others and for the world. Because we see the same struggle, the same journey, happening in every human being. It is the flower of consciousness blooming in the garden of existence. Carl Jung believed that the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. Individuation is this act of kindling the light. It is the contribution that each of us can make to the evolution of collective consciousness. It is a solitary journey, for no one can walk your path for you. But it is also a profoundly connected journey, for in finding your center, you find the center that unites us all. The journey does not end. It only deepens. With each new cycle of life, new challenges will arise, demanding new deaths and rebirths. But now you have the map, you have the compass. You know that the darkness has a purpose, and that your ruin is always an invitation to your most glorious rescue.